I'm making this presentation from the unceded territories of the ʷÄÄNÄN and WSÁNEĆ nations. I have endless gratitude for the privilege to live and learn on these lands, as well as I would be remiss to not recognize that my relationship as a settler on these lands and the very people that they belong to have greatly influenced my understanding and appreciation of life. I take this understanding and respect into my exploration of Navajo silverwork. The image you see I took on a misty October morning at Sungeka, aka Caddy Bay, which was home to the Sungeka community for at least 8,000 years before the mid-1800s. Out of my personal interest in jewelry creation, I wanted to learn more about what, in generic terms, is referred to as Southwestern style silverwork. There are some popular elements of this jewelry that at times feels overproduced and potentially misrepresentative. I wanted to find the deeper connections of these popularized motifs and symbols that primarily originate from Navajo silverwork. To do this, I decided to search for similarities in the stylistic elements of Navajo silverwork and Navajo textile weaving, basketry, and a bit of pottery. Before I provide any comparative context or art object analysis, I would like to begin with a poem. Grandmother Moon. Tonight is the lunar eclipse. Tonight the moon blooms. Tonight my grandmother is home. The cornfield carpets the canyon's basin, a Navajo field of colored corn, red, yellow, blue, and white. Grandmother Nalnishi whispers to the moon. Her turquoise jewels reflect the dinner fire. In the distance, the bells of the sheep ring. Overhead, the moon begins to glow. Tonight is the lunar eclipse. Tonight the moon blossoms. Tonight my grandmother is home. The image you see is of Monument Valley Tribal Park with the supermoon of 2017 in the sky. This excerpt from contemporary Navajo poet Hirschman John, poem Grandmother Moon, from his book I Swallow Turquoise for Courage, captures the importance of one of the most iconic elements of Navajo silverwork, turquoise. The hypnotic blue gemstone was not part of early silverwork in Navajo culture, but it always has been part of Navajo culture. Due to its symbolism, significance, and value, it is no surprise that it would eventually be a defining feature. Turquoise has been a sacred mineral to the Navajo and surrounding communities since creation. The references to the gemstone in the creation story of the Navajo people is frequent and significant. From the turquoise coral-tipped shovels used by the first Dene people to dig the water channels on Earth, to first man creating the sun with a disk of turquoise. One of the stories is about Changing Woman, or ʷÄÄN Atelehai, who was found by a group of Navajo as a carved piece of turquoise. Changing Woman changed from the stone into the powerful goddess that she was and created more of the Navajo out of her own skin, which was turquoise. It is no surprise that Helen Hardin's famous Woman series includes and began with Changing Woman. The meaning and significance of Changing Woman to Hardin is not necessarily or entirely that of ʷÄÄN Atelehai, since the paintings in the series had very personal meaning as well for her, but Changing Woman does have two strands of turquoise hanging from her neck. Helen Hardin's incorporation of a Navajo creation story as a Santa Clara Pueblo woman is an example of the sharing of ideas and practices within the ancestral Pueblo communities and regions, which the Navajo also share. When comparing the two maps, we can see the current-day Navajo boundaries were not this way traditionally, nor are they considered reflective of only one people. The ancestral Pueblo areas were very broad and communities within them were diverse and influenced by each other. When Spanish colonists began to occupy these lands, the ancestral Pueblo communities were aggressively relocated and forced into certain areas like Mexico. This process also caused further influences in between cultural groups, which can be seen in eye dazzler blankets, for example. The eye dazzler blankets were greatly influenced by Mexican weavers on the Navajo during the mid to late 1800s. This exchanging, influencing, and sharing of designs in between ancestral Pueblo, Navajo, Mexican, and Spanish communities caused many art forms to change from traditional practices. Basketry, textile weaving, and even some pottery practices overlapped in the communities. Because silverwork did not become a Navajo practice until the mid-1800s, the design elements were more reflective of a mix of Mexican, Zuni, other ancestral Pueblo silversmiths, as well as Navajo styles. In addition to cross-cultural influences due to proximity, as the English colonists became interested in traditional art objects made by the ancestral Pueblo and the Navajo community's particular styles and products had a greater demand for production. These stylistic influences can be seen in some great and incredible examples in Navajo rug weaving. As mentioned before, the eye dazzler blankets are a perfect example of the Mexican influence on Navajo weavers, but the crystal rugs are a showcase of European and Arabic influence due to the demand of European tourists wanting similar designs that they had seen in the East. In addition to this, rugs were originally blankets that were reworked into being rugs due to tourist demand. In addition to the arts and crafts movement-driven popularity of textile souvenirs, the small and portable jewelry items were just as desirable by tourists and trading posts to the extent that knockoff Navajo-styled silver jewelry was being factory-made and sold as authentic Navajo silverwork. This early form of cultural appropriation and mass production of jewelry has persisted well into the current day to what we now know as Southwestern style silverwork. This appropriation and manufacturing of counterfeit Navajo silverwork has been an ongoing issue since its popularity, and in the 1930s, in an attempt to crack down on this issue, the U.S. government began to issue the stamp U.S. Navajo, spelled with an H, on authentic Navajo silverwork. Fast forward to 2020, and the issue has grown into a multi-level international drug ring-like operation that includes many Southwest Indigenous arts being ripped off overseas and exported back to America and all over the world. The National Geographic covered the 2017 investigation of fraudster jewelry dealer Nail Ali. The graphic on the screen is a portion of the map created by the National Geographic depicting locations of counterfeit Zuni, Pueblo, and Navajo silverwork manufacture and distribution. It was discovered that both owners of the factories and manufacturing plants located in the Philippines were owned by Palestinian families. From there, under this company name, would sell their products as authentic Southwest Indigenous art objects to jewelry dealers like Nae Ali, who would then further distribute the items across America to other jewelers who didn't know the plan and buyers as well. This larger-than-life international operation is only one of many in action that profoundly impact the welfare and preservation of authentic silverwork artisans of the Southwest. This broad-scale abuse is the primary reason for Southwestern style and the jewelry being popularly called boho. Influences and appropriation and counterfeit manufacture aside, there are specific Navajo silverwork techniques, objects, and designs that share similarity to Navajo woven textiles and basketry, and even sometimes pottery. Most of these are not part of the fraudulent knockoff of silverworks. Being able to appreciate these techniques specific to Navajo silverwork and the work required to properly execute them empowers admirers of Navajo silverwork to respect the art objects as well as recognize authentic creations. I would also argue this awareness enables ally settlers to protect contemporary artists from being ripped off. Often the Navajo silverwork techniques are what persists today as being defining factors of silverwork being Navajo. The primary being cold forging, the shaping of silver with the use of dies, hammers, and stamps. This application of this technique began in the mid-1800s when trade with the Mexican and Spanish made silver coins available. Silver coins would be cold formed by hand with a hammer, pick heads, and bolts on hard stones for anvils. Today, stone anvils are replaced with iron anvils, but the application of handmade metal stamps and dies persist. The use of stamps and dies in Navajo style of repoussé and chasing. The primary effect that is achieved with repoussé and chasing, or stamps and bump out dies is the three-dimensional sculptural shaping of the metal sheets. The key distinction between repoussé and chasing and Navajo stamping and dies is that one enables the artist to work with pre-made, somewhat geometrical designs, while the other is used to form metal into organic images. But the concept is the same, to create decorative impressions into the metal. The important thing to define here is a lot of techniques that are used by the Navajo traditionally and in contemporary form that define Navajo silverwork are, yes, a part of silversmithing in general and cross-culturally all over the world, but the use of the dyes, the stylistic dyes and stamps that leave the impressions that they do in the silverwork metals are a key distinguishing factor of Navajo silverwork. The most classic example of this repoussé Navajo effect can be seen on concha shells or concha belts, concho belts, as well as the technique itself is integral to the formation of the globe silver beads, or also known as the silver pearls, that make up the squash blossom necklaces in squash blossom necklaces. The silver globe beads often stand on their own as well. These examples are some of the most traditional Navajo silverwork applications, but contemporary artists will divert from this in some instances while making reference to it in the form of a different style of dyes and metal forming. The image on the top left is a contemporary bump out stamp with a 7-pointed star. The one on the right is a contemporary traditional style oval concho belt stamp. Both are handmade out of rebar sticks and have been carved to produce the shapes that they do when hit into the metal being worked on. These are actual products produced in present day by the Linden family in New Mexico. The photo on the bottom is of a later Navajo concha belt. It's a later period concha belt because it lacks the 2 center holes that the leather belt would have passed through to wear the concha. These newer style conchas have been soldered on the back and can have a centralized bump out motif. Although concha belts are the most well-known in Navajo silverwork, they are not invented by the Navajo. They are an object made by Mexican silver workers, but the Navajo adapted the concha into their own style, and that is now synonymous with Navajo silverwork. A very important factor to consider is that although silverwork, as I mentioned before, is an international practice, what defines Navajo silverwork is the way that it's used and the style that's a part of it, the style that has been appropriated and sold all over the world as fraudulent. It's a pretty great style. Sand casting is the other primary technique used in Navajo silverwork. Sandstone was originally used and still sometimes used today, but the tufa is more common now for its ability to hold more detailed carving. This short video clip of Navajo silversmith George Francis explaining the difference between sandstone and tufa is a perfect example of what casting molds look like and how they are used.
Cast work involves different types, and with Navajo silversmiths, we have 2 types that a lot of people use. Cast work can be done with wax, etc., lost wax castings, etc. But in the old days, we learned to do it with sand casting, and I'll show you an example of a cast. And that cast here is in sandstone, and it's a Niddah cast. And a lot of people now, instead of going out to do the sandstone cast, they find products like tufa, which is volcanic ash, and they use it more. And it's just as quick and just as efficient. With these castings, you look for the proper stone. Texture, fineness, firmness, those are things you're looking for, because especially if you're doing detailed castings, at that point you want to have very good firm stones but able to still do your work. And ash being very fine, you can do those detail work. With sandstone, where the granules are, or the texture is granular because of being sandstone, a little more difficult to do much more detailed work.
How long would it take you to do a finely detailed?
In sandstone, no, if you could do it, it would, carving out the design takes quite an amount of time. Sometimes, if it just depends if you have the time, 1 to 3 days. For this example, it took me one day, not one day, but one morning, and I didn't work on it totally the whole time. So we're probably talking an hour maybe to get this design. Very simple, nothing to work at. In tufa, it took me about the same amount of time, maybe about an hour, and get the things. So these little lines you see are just basically to chase the air out of there as it fills in. Of course, you have to have a back plate on everything that you do, because this is the side that I want done, and this side will cover that, and that's the flat side. So that's how that works. But the designs are made, if it's a detailed design, it could take anywhere more than 1 day, definitely for sure. And I've seen some of these people with their work up to 3 or 4 days to complete the work. And then that's just the part of the design. Then they cast and pour it. Then they have to sit there and clean that back up again, and that might take another day or two, depending on how much time they can allow to give it. And then they say, and usually they don't get paid what they're really worth, but they do a good job.
Originally, to this day, the silverwork would be melted in a crucible and poured into a sheet or ingot of silver, which would then be hammered into the desired shape. The earliest silver adornments made this way were triangular cross-section bracelets. The ingot would be shaped to fit around the wrist, and on the top side of the bracelet, triangle or would be V-shapes stamped into the metal. The image you see is a pre-carved and poured bracelet, blank, and silver shaped ingot made by the Linden family from a tufa stone carving. They have offered silversmiths a chance to bypass the extra work of carving, as George Francis was pointing out in his video. It is a great deal of work, and pouring the ingot in advance, so that all that you have to do is pay them a nominal fee, and you can form your own bracelet or your own design. But this covered marketing is a great example of what the starting point of traditional Navajo cold forming silverwork technique would look like. It would be one of these pieces, and then they'd be hammered out and stamped or die repoussé, and that would result in what we really associate with Navajo silverwork. The common silverwork objects made by Navajo artists are concha bells, rings, swedged bracelets, silver globe beads, or silver pearls, gato, naja, and silver buttons. All of these objects have various types of design elements before the addition of bezeled stones like turquoise. The styles are also subject to each artist's own eye. The first silverwork object thought to have been made by the Navajo was cold-formed ingot bracelets that had a triangle cross-section. These ended in hands or snake heads and a tail. The image of the bracelet here is a good example of the shape, as well as the imprinted V design that makes up the scales of the snake. You might already see the similarity of the design to the eye dazzler blanket from earlier. The image was taken from an eBay auction, but shares similarities to the other Navajo bracelets made in the same fashion for tourists. The swedged bracelets that you see in the center came later and are a uniquely formed metal sheet band, so a wide sheet, kind of like the blanks that we saw that the Linden family had pre-poured and made available for silversmiths to cold work themselves. The way these swedged bracelets are formed is that they are taken in their sheet form and hammered into a sheet, almost like a bead shot like plate, creating a concave and convex pattern. As you can see here, there's the bumpy effect. That would be because it was actually hammered into a impression, a metal plate of some form that would cause this indentation to form from hammering in place. This right here, of course, is the gato, and the gato is a really cool development on the arrow guards, because there would be traditionally leather arrow guards, but this was a further added protection as well as accent made with silver. Silver globe beads or silver pearls are the basis for the classic squash blossom necklaces. The beads themselves are a labor of love that are formed by hand and then carefully soldered together. To make the squash blossom petals are added, creating the blossom. The certainty of it being a squash blossom has been hotly debated, with some arguing that they're actually pomegranates that were inspired by Spanish silver adornments, as well as instead of being squash blossoms, they were sunflower blossoms. In addition to the silver globe beads, with the petals, the casting of the Niddah crescent finishes off the complete squash blossom necklace. The Navajo were known to be the first to create the Niddah and the squash blossoms. However, these exact design elements have occurred in the Zuni, the Hopi, as well. Yeah, the Zuni and the Hopi are the two that also use the same styles of the Niddah and the squash blossoms. The Niddah has been compared to the crescent adornments on Spanish horses as well, but to find pictorial examples of these is very difficult. However, the crest symbol of the Niddah is something that many cultures around the world has used. I think the biggest significant thing to note about the tendency to try and remove the individual influence of Navajo on their own silverwork is a reflection of a lot of, we could even say systemic racism, among many other things regarding how Indigenous people are viewed and treated. But moreover, it's a little bit ridiculous because of course there can be influences within a lot of artistic creations, and this is an example. Whether or not the squash blossoms are in fact pomegranates inspired by the Spanish, and whether or not the najas are inspired by Moorish horse adornments, it is not necessarily the priority here as much as it is the way the Navajo interpreted what they had seen or what they had already had in mind and recreated in this new medium of silver in the mid 1800s and onward. I would also argue that the squash blossom design that we do see here on the slide does really match squash blossom motifs found on pottery, which I am pulling into this, even though I was originally only focusing on textiles. There are pottery motifs that do really show up in a lot of metalwork as well. Adornments on the motifs found in Navajo silverwork are connected to ancestral Navajo designs, but also other neighboring communities. I have included 2 pottery examples. The rest are textile and basket-based designs because the motifs of Maria Martinez feathers are very apparent on the silver buttons I'll be showing on the next slide, as well as the squash blossom on her polychrome jar could be seen in the silver squash blossom beads that we just saw before. The Navajo wedding tray has a deeper meaning, but the sun-like star can be seen in the Yavapai basket as well, as both motifs can be seen in silverwork throughout the presentation. The use of stars and also the geometric points and diamonds and V's have been a reoccurring theme within many pieces of the Navajo silverwork shown. And we can really see right here with the polychrome jar that Maria Martinez created, that the squash blossom is very similar to the squash blossom metal reconfiguration. It has a round globus bottom and an extension for the petals that go up and curl outward. And of course it is a bit shorter here, but it's all about artistic impression. Now really remember, although it's hard to forget, Maria Martinez, the famous feather motif that she developed, because it is important to see this. The importance of this sharing of imagery and design across times and communities is that they are steeped in a historical and ancestral inspiration. Even contemporary designs in Navajo silverwork are a product of a non-linear timeline. The crystal rug you see here is an example again of how the use of geometric design elements are a recurring design attribute in Navajo silverwork. The reason the crystal rugs look the way they do is not only because of J.B. Moore crystal's influences. There were already popular design styles that Navajo artists enjoyed using in their arts. It is no surprise that given the opportunity to diversify in the application of these creative styles, that Navajo artists would use the creative challenge that J.B. Moore would provide, just in the same way Navajo artists would experiment and make silversmithing their own. As you can see right here in the lower, just beneath the crystal rug, we can see these contemporary, perhaps there's no date that was available for them. They're called vintage, and sometimes that would be categorized for the 70s and 60s because of the popularity in Navajo style jewelry at that point. But the feather motif on these silver buttons is incredibly striking and very reminiscent of Maria Martinez's feathers that we saw on her tray in the previous slide. And this set of vintage, so once again, they're of course contemporary, silver earrings that are based on the Navajo button really do mirror that star, but the radial and the radiations are incorporated into the triangles of the points of the star or sun. And these radiations have been seen in baskets. They have been seen in, you could even compare it to the crystal carpet or crystal rug right here with the triangles, and these triangles and diamonds pop up quite frequently throughout Navajo textiles, basketry, and pottery. There's a sharing of these designs and these techniques and recreating them in the different mediums, as artists do. In retrospect, this attempt to cover a topic as dynamic and broad as this was very ambitious of me. There are many aspects that I regrettably have not been able to properly include and represent as a result. I believe that it would be ideal to take the same amount of focus and analysis I have done here and apply it to only one Navajo silverwork piece type. For example, the squash blossom necklace alone has 3 distinct elements. It has the silver pearls, it has the squash blossom beads, and it has the Niddah. So by trying to even just analyze the squash blossom necklace on itself alone would be quite an ordeal in itself. It would be most ideal to, for example, just spend time addressing only the silver pearls or only the squash blossoms themselves, because even at that, those were very contested. The Niddah alone has so much behind it. Taking that to that extent, and the extent that I attempted to in this project, was a little bit much. This student mistake has, however, further expressed the validity of just how interconnected life and our experience of it is. The Navajo silversmith practice and creativity mirrors basketry, weaving, pottery, and painting. The creative process of making something is a sacred process that is informed by history, family, community, and the love of the world that surrounds the artist. And I think that is the most important aspect of this project. Everything is deeply connected. There's no way of trying to cover everything at once, but by covering one small area of it, you will end up being pulled off into another direction related to the main theme. Thank you. The picture that you see right here is another view of Monument Valley. This is from the Utah and Arizona area or direction, versus the first one was from the, pointing from Colorado. I hope I have that right.